Welcome to Word and Words. We just had beautiful introduction music to a new podcast where myself, Andrew, and Phil are launching. And we'll introduce it, but it might be useful to figure out who each of us are first before we introduce the podcast. So, Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Phil, then I guess I'll go last.
For sure. So I am currently a pastoral assistant at Grandview Church in Kitchener. I am starting a PhD this fall at the University of Nottingham. I'm kind of at the intersection of technology and theology, and that's what I love to talk about and think about and read about, and I'm looking forward to chatting.
Awesome. Phil?
Yeah, I'm a Bible college graduate many moons ago and have been in the private sector in industrial automation, and just an avid reader and blogger, writer, editor, and just interested in lots of different things. So good to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Wyatt Graham. I'm currently the executive director of the Gospel Coalition Canada, and I teach and write and read books, I guess. I have a family, too. They exist.
Yeah, I could have added my family. I have 2 kids.
I also have a family. Yeah. They're awesome.
Yeah, there we go. So this podcast, I think, was born out of just a private group to help encourage each other to write that we started with one other person, I believe. Us right at the beginning. And we thought it might be fun to sort of expand on these ideas and to create a podcast that we would record like maybe twice a month or something like that. And we decided to call it Word and Words as part of a conviction that there is ultimate reason to the universe, and our words should correspond to that order. And the phrase that I love, one of those sentences that is kind of like one of my soul sentences, I should say, is a sentence said by George Grant, the late 20th century philosopher. He said, "Beyond space and time, there is order. Beyond space and time, there is order." And I thought about this as order is something that you can discover. Order is something that is rational. Order is something that is real. And all that we say, think, or do should correspond to that order. It's an old idea, but I believe it's a true idea. And I think for this podcast, we're going to talk about all sorts of things, sometimes controversial, sometimes not, sometimes maybe a bit weird, who knows. But all of our speech, all of our thinking should correspond to that order that is beyond space and time. And today, we decided to talk about the idea of pursuing glory and perhaps honor as well. And the reason why is, I think I was talking about it, and Andrew kind of picked up on it and thought this might be a good thing that we could discuss. But the idea is that for many people in our culture, the idea of pursuing glory, pursuing honor feels like this sort of off-limits thing because it's yes. Hey, bud. I don't know. You need to leave because I'm in the middle of a thing. All right. Well, I do have a family, so I'll restart, and that might be fun. We can keep it in. Okay, so the idea is that pursuing glory and honor could be viewed as prideful because it is all about you. It's sort of a me-centered thing, and yet in the classical tradition, the medieval tradition, all sorts of traditions, pursuing glory and honor was something that you ought to do. It's even found in the biblical tradition. So, for example, the Apostle Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, writes in the 2nd chapter of Romans that God will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. The key line there is that with patience and well-doing, we ought to seek glory and honor and immortality. And if you read, the rest of the biblical tradition, you'll end up seeing all these passages like in 2 Thessalonians, Christ will be glorified in us. You will be glorified. You will receive glory. God made you for glory. All these sorts of things that are contrary to how we often talk about glory and honor, as if these are somehow bad things. And I wonder, and this is how I'll start the conversation, I'll give it to you. I wonder if there's a bit of an intersection with a lot of the masculinity discourse where guys are trying to seek, maybe truth or glory and honor, and Christians sometimes want to push back against that, and yet our own text and our own Western traditions emphasize the goodness of glory and honor. Is there something there, and are we maybe missing something important in this conversation? I don't know if you guys want to add to that or not.
Yeah, I think one thing that I immediately comes to mind is just this knee-jerk reaction of any glory seeking is wrong. There's a story about William Wilberforce that the day after the law was passed for the abolition of slavery, he obviously had a huge part in that. He goes home and he meditates on Psalm 115, verse 1, which is not to us, O Lord, but to you be the glory. And so here you have someone who is deserving of praise for the work that he's done, but his meditation, his reflection is, oh no, and based around the Psalms, you don't want to seek glory in the wrong way. Or is there, what is the psalmist getting at there? And how does that fit with what Paul is getting at? Because obviously my presupposition here is that scripture doesn't contradict. But it does seem like this can confuse folks. Even in my own mind, it's almost easier to just ignore the Romans 2. It's easier just to say, well, God gets all the glory. Don't even say thank you when someone gives you a compliment. Just say, well, it's all God, not me. Christ in me, not me. And so how do we kind of reconcile this posture of giving God glory, which is obviously good, with seeking glory, which is what you kind of started us off with?
And before I move to Phil, one piece on when someone, say, encourages you or honors you, you often hear people say, well, you've humbled me. But no, you've elevated me. That's the point of honoring someone.
Right.
And it's a good thing. It's what encouragement is often. Phil, do you have words of wisdom from Quebec?
I don't know how wise they are, but it's, one verse that comes to mind is, and I was going to look it up. I actually don't remember exactly where it's from. Maybe you guys can help me. But, do not seek great things for yourself. I remember Don Carson writing a very powerful article on that idea of, that there is a trap for anyone seeking to make an impact, that, there is an aspect of the human nature that we call it the ego, we call it pride. And so I think what people are afraid of when they get squirrely about glory is pride, the sin of pride. And so that's a legitimate danger. But I think what we're getting at is that there's an overreaction possible to say we should not seek any glory or attention or things like that. And that seems wrong too, for the reasons that you've been laying out. And I think glory is a normal sort of good and natural aspect of God's created order. Everything he made has a glory, a certain glory, and great acts and accomplishments, and these things, they contain and they manifest a certain glory that we, I think, rightly recognize. And so it's not a wrong thing, that's just a part of the way God made the world. But then it's what you do with that. And I think that's where we need to think carefully about how to process that.
Well, and I think this gets to the definitional question then almost right away, because do not seek great things for yourself, pride, vainglory. Those are all words that we need to use to clarify the positive definitions of glory and honor. Because when I say seeking glory is good, I think Paul says that, the Bible frequently does. It doesn't say vainglory is good. And when it says to seek honor, it doesn't say that pride is good. So there needs to be a distinction. I'll give you my off-the-cuff definitions, and maybe you guys can modify them or come from different angles on that. So for these two words, when I think of the word glory, I think glory is the effect of a good work. Mm-hmm. Paul brings it up as well. Glory is when you see something beautifully painted, beautifully done, a great parent, a great athlete, a great job at work. That carries with it a sense of glory. It is the accomplished deed that is objectively glorious. Mm-hmm. Honor is the right praise of a genuinely good work. Which means, if you're pursuing glory, if you want to make it ultra simple, and though there can be nuance here, glory is another way of saying pursuing good in all that you do. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to say we shouldn't pursue that. If I want to do a great job playing guitar, doing music, you should pursue that. But you're not doing it out of the desire of vainglory, namely the desire to get other people to like you more, to be on your side, the sort of idea that you're doing it to sort of trick people to like you, even though it's kind of no, you're doing it because it is glorious. Everything that God created is in potential glorious. And when you got potential, kid, when you actually fulfill that potential, become a great artist, a great musician, a great worker, a great parent, you are bringing that piece of culture to fruition. And I think that is glorious. And then encouragement and right praise is honor. When my son does something like he obeys his mom or does a great thing in sport, I'll say, great job, son. Or you really improved. That's honoring him. It's not at this, but I'm not lying. I'm not praising him. What's it called? It's not flattery. Flattery is false praise in order to get someone to do something for you, typically. Mm-hmm. No, I'm not giving him flattery. I'm honoring him because it's right. I mean, often that's what encouragement is. Not in every form of encouragement. Often encouragement is honoring someone for what they've done well, to encourage them to do more and to dive in better. So for me, it's a bit of a Thomistic definition. I know there's more to the story than that. But if I was to make it ultra simple without nuance, glory is a good work done. Honor is saying that is a good work. So I don't know if you guys want to expand on that or come at it from different angles, because I know you can think of it from society, culture, etc. as well.
No, I find that really helpful because of the way that, like when Phil was saying that glory is kind of everywhere in a sense to different degrees, you just have this, well, wait, to what degree? And in a fallen world, how fallen are these potential glory things affected? And so you even have in the garden, when I think of Adam and Eve, and I think of they had potential there too. So the garden was not in a state forever. There was a potential there, and there was a recognition that God had to it, like repeated over and over of it is good, and then the very good. You have that almost, is that honor? Almost, Wyatt? Would you is God almost honoring or he's reflecting?
God crowns his own gifts.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is that right there.
But what you could have got to is Psalm 19, which is also about creation, that the heavens declare the glory of God. And they do precisely because God does things that are very good. Right.
And that's the I think the most important thing that is in this idea of glory, and the difference between vain or not is the idea of integrity or wholeness. If you lose that, then you start to get it mixed up. And so that's where I think if you seek after something and you're holistically, pursuing it as opposed to pursuing it just on the appearance or just inward and not outer, like there can be a type of person who doesn't want anybody to know their good work, and they just go and they use the verse of don't let, the right hand know what the left hand is doing. But the few lines before in Jesus's sermon was also the lamp on the hill. Right. So there is a and what Jesus is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jonathan Peddington gets at this in his book, is he's getting at this idea of wholeness or teleos, the idea of completeness, that we ought to have a completeness to our lives and how we live, that he argues that it comes even out of the Old Testament when we think about shalom, that there's almost that concept in the idea of teleos in the New Testament, this idea of wholeness, completeness. And so I think that's where, if glory is a part of that, and you're living a whole life and glory comes with that, then you can enjoy the glory you receive, even right. from people. But if it's not holistic, if it's not whole or complete, then you end up with danger.
Yeah, and Phil mentioned earlier that there's different kinds of glories. There's the glory of a seed and potential as a tree, and is glorious when it becomes a tree and has fruition. There's the glory of a human body as it grows into a man or a woman, and it fulfills all the ambitions that are built into what it means to be human. And I think that's really important to measure. At the same time, I think your cautions are helpful. Like even in that passage in Romans 2, remember it's in patience in well-doing. So in well-doing, so in doing good,
Right.
in this context, you're seeking glory and honor. And the contrast in the verse 8 of chapter 2 of Romans is
Self-seeking.
with self-seekingness, vainglory. So
And rejecting the truth and following
rejecting
evil.
the truth. So something is good because it's true. And this goes back to what does it actually mean to transform your mind. So, for example, Hebrews 4, the author there says that by habit, you can discern good from evil. And that is what it means to be mature, which is actually the word that it's a form of teleos there. I think it might be the same form of it. So by means of mental discernment, discerning between good and evil by habit, so by practice, more and more you know what is good or right, you become more, we might say, complete, which is the same idea, for example, in Romans 12, where the idea of an internal renewal of the mind is that you might know what is good and beautiful and perfect. So I think the idea of glory is tied into some really concrete ideas. It's not just a flowery, amorphous definition, but it really means a patient pursuit of the good by habit, and that habit is specifically learning to know good from evil so that more and more you can avoid evil and choose the good, which makes you more and more glorious. You might say you move from one level of glory to another, or you might say that like a tree, you're moving from seed to initial budding to full fruition. However you want to call that, there is a progress of virtue, and honor, or glory rather. And I think our job, if you're a parent in particular, is to make sure that your children, you honor them in their growth and glory, so that they know. And the reason why, and this is how I'll pause after this statement, I'll let someone else jump in, is, and you kind of alluded to it, Andrew, is this idea that we have to hide our good works. We can't be a light on the hill, put under a bushel or whatever. We have to protect them so nobody knows. It has to be completely private and individualistic, because if anyone else knows and supports you, then somehow it's bad because it's pride. But in fact, keeping that as an individual, private thing and not sharing your good works, which is glory, is inherently selfish. And so you should share that, not for vainglory reasons, not for pride reasons, but I want my son to tell his siblings and to us, hey, I did this, or can I show you what I've done? And I want to say, good job, son, keep it up. Because we're sharing as non-individuals a collective glory in our familial goal of being virtuous. It's not, a Lone Ranger virtue. It's groupish.
Groupish.
Well,
Groupish, technical language.
It's the seminary student who's sitting listening to someone else preach, and they know they're not as good as that preacher, but this person who sits there and they go, wow, this is a great sermon. This is a great preacher, as opposed to, I wish I could be like that. Like, your habit, your virtue will inform, well, it has been formed in you, in order to have those two different dispositions. And that's where I like the habit piece that you brought in, because you can display a kind of pursuit of glory in a really good way, and then you can enjoy the glory of others, because I think that's what God wants for us. Like, going back to Psalm 19, like the sun that rises and sets, the psalmist describes it in this very, like, it has joy. Like, there's just joy that's wrapped up in God's creation and in his glory. You can't really separate that receiving of glory from joy. They're kind of connected there too.
I agree. I think that makes sense, because the glory of any act, like you've been describing, it's the goodness and the glory of it is a reflection of the goodness and glory of God, from which all things derive their being. And so there isn't fundamentally a tension between the glory of a tree and the glory of God, right? Not everyone makes that connection, and I think there's people who rightly value the glory of all kinds of things in the created world. And you know what? That's why non-Christians can write things that are really edifying and helpful, because they can rightly see the glory of this or that historical event, or help you see the glory of whatever it is that they're reflecting or observing. But ultimately, those of from God's source. But I think the thing that sort of works in my mind as you describe all this is, I'm not sure we can have a discussion about glory without sort of having at the same time a conversation about humility. So what does humility look like? If humility is not just avoiding things that might lead to glory, what does humility look like, even as you perhaps have ambitious things that you're working towards? And how do you define humility in such a way that it's not in tension with what you're describing? And one thing that I've always sort of carried with me as a helpful definition and framework for humility is something that C.S. Lewis writes in the Screwtape Letters. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but I'm going through it with my kids right now, 2 of my kids. So I happen to have a copy here on my desk. So do you guys mind if I read a little passage?
Yeah,
Go for it.
So he talks about humility. I won't read the whole thing, but he's saying, fix in his mind. This is the demon speaking, of course. Fix in his mind the idea that humility consists in trying to believe those talents to be less valuable than he believes them to be. The great thing is to make him value an opinion for some quality other than truth, thus introducing an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise threatens to become a virtue. By this method, thousands of humans have been brought to think that humility means pretty women trying to believe they are ugly and clever men trying to believe they are fools. And since what they are trying to believe may in some cases be manifest nonsense, they cannot succeed in believing it, and we have the chance of keeping their minds endlessly revolving on themselves in an effort to achieve the impossible. So then, he says, the enemy's strategy is to bring the man to a state of mind in which he could design the best cathedral in the world and know it to be the best and rejoice in the fact without being any more or less or otherwise glad at having done it than he would be if it had been done by another. I think that's helpful in this conversation, because building a beautiful cathedral is a glorious thing. And it's right to recognize that. But I think humility is, like he describes, finding glory in the thing and the goodness of it, not the fact that it was me who did it and, hey, everyone pay attention to me.
So two distinctions kind of come to mind. So one is in the virtue tradition, or I guess the vice tradition, acedia or sloth. One form of that is not fulfilling the glory that you're called to. So it's failing to achieve the glory to which you were called. So that could be God calls you to glory and to honor and so on, and you don't actually go for it. So, so denying that, it wouldn't be humility, actually. It would be a form of sloth. And then the other distinction that sort of comes to mind is, I think you mentioned it, but basically, glory it's about truth. No, here's what it was. Sorry, I forgot. Here's what it was. So glory, the distinction between anyone can do a glorious work, but your intentions, your thoughts of it, you can engage in vainglory and pride, all these sorts of things. But at least in the biblical tradition, all of our good works are aimed at reflecting the glory of God, so that other people see those good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. That is something that a Christian uniquely can do, and is why there's a safety given our intent for pursuing glory and honor, which isn't always there in other traditions. So if you're just seeking glory for your own sake, and the end is you itself, then that particular work, you might be the efficient cause, there might be matter and form, but there's no final cause to it. There's no real cause beyond navel gazing. But if your goal is to do a good work because it's beautiful, and then allow that beauty to reflect, to redound the reflective the illumination of God, so it bounces off the good works and goes up to heaven. Everyone sees the God signal, as it were, through that good work. Then I think that's good. So when I think about humility, I think the protection that a Christian has is that good work that you're pursuing ultimately ought to redound so that people see that good work and glorify God in heaven. Yeah. And secondly, the caution I would say is not pursuing glory because you're afraid, or celebrating or being glad in it and being rejoicing in it could be sloth, which is a mortal sin. And I think we should be much more worried. And the way I get of that than anything else, and the way I get to that is I think a lot of men in particular are trying to avoid pursuing glory and honor because they don't want to offend someone else. They don't want to move too far into being like, oh, I'm awesome. But that spills over into how you're in your marriage and your family life and in your work life. And I think a lot of us feel like we have to hold back, even though we're called to a greater glory. Remember, when I say greater glory, all I mean by that is in patience and in well-doing, we're good. Seeking a good work done that is objectively good, and we've identified it's good because by habit we've discerned good from evil, and we're choosing good over evil. So that good work rightly should provide honor to us, and we have all the different kind of safety nets through that. So I think that there's a bit of a, we might call it a masculinity crisis, where a lot of guys are engaging in sloth. They might actually be very high-performing people, have money and all that kind of stuff, but they're not pursuing goodness, and they feel like they can't get out in front. They can't kind of promote something that they're doing, because if they do that, especially if they're a Christian, that's somehow pride. But actually, that could be acedia, that could be sloth, that could be a mortal sin.
Yeah, it feels like there's the activity itself, whether that activity is good or whether that activity is actually there, or if you're just slothful. There's the habit underneath that activity, which is also important here. And then the thing that really stuck out in what you just said earlier on was the purpose of it. If you don't have a purpose behind what you're doing beyond yourself, then you're getting caught in the pride trap, as opposed to having the greater reflection of a greater glory than yourself. And yeah, there's different directions we could go with this. Phil, you were talking earlier before we hit record about why you think Protestants sometimes have failed to recognize glory. Did you blame Martin Luther for this or something? But like we kind of, in Protestant circles, sometimes there is this, whatever, different circles, as we've talked about this problem of not pursuing glory from different angles. But why are we scared of that term? Why don't we use the term glory?
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting on the well-known distinction that Luther draws between the theologians or theology of glory in his day, and then what he was advocating for, which was a theology of the cross. And I think he was talking about something different than what we're talking about, and maybe why you have, or Andrew, you have a clearer sense. I haven't reviewed that stuff in a little while, so it's a little fuzzy in my mind as to what he was distancing himself from and what he was advocating. But it does seem like, I think what you're trying to get at, why, and I think it's true, is there's like an undercurrent in evangelical Protestantism that there's a real hesitation to really get out there and accomplish things, and seek excellence and seek influence, positions of high status, and we're always very, very worried about that, and I think there's some rightful cautions. But there's that Dave Harvey book, Rescuing Ambition, which I think touches on some of this. I think Aaron Wren has spoken to this in a lot of his writing, where he's trying to push back against some of the stereotypical teaching that the evangelical church has had for men, and that it's all about servant leadership, and that this is the path to success, for finding a mate, and for your life as a man. And he's just, I think, rightly pointing out that's incomplete. So I agree. And I'd love to maybe hear you guys, because this can go too far as well. I think there's a stream on a certain wing of evangelicalism, that I think would seek a kind of glory and a certain manifestation of masculinity that I do think is an imbalance and it has a danger in it. So what does it look like, Wyatt? You brought the subject up, so you have to tell us the answer. What does it look like to if we keep talking about this masculinity aspect of it, what does it look like to pursue that?
Well, I think masculinity is bound up in virtue. So I think masculinity in our larger cultural conversation is often bound up in specific cultural applications of, the myth of like 1950s masculinity. You're a buff guy on the beach and you kick sand into someone's face or whatever. So I think we need to sort of say that some of those applications could be valuable, but get to the heart of what it means to be male, what it means to be masculine. I think that's bound up in virtue, goodness, truth, and beauty. I think it's bound up in our biological potential, which includes protection, family, progeny, all that kind of stuff. It's also bound up, I think, in our calling as Christians, if you're a Christian, in pursuing goodness and virtue and beauty. So I think when you get those basic definitions down, then the applications, you begin to see, okay, so you have a guy who, I can't remember the guy's name, who just got arrested recently, that's kind of in the manosphere.
Andrew Tate,
who, his version of masculinity is being physically strong, having non-monogamous relationship with many women. I think he has some kids, but doesn't seem to be like marriage and kids. Some of the videos I've seen him talk about how he would influence women in order to, make money off of them. All of that is completely unvirtuous and therefore unmasculine. It's you might say, if you're going to use Aristotelian discourse, all the stuff that you see on Twitter, the Andrew Tate stuff, all the verbiage in kind of an Aristotelian view, that's all feminine. It's kind of hilarious. But I wouldn't even go that way. I don't fully go with that. I would just say that can't be masculine because it's unvirtuous. Masculinity has to equal goodness. And it has to equal goodness in the created form that you're in. That the matter of your body is important, and we inform that through the mind. And the efficient cause of whatever we're informing the body with is the Word of God, both in special revelation, the Bible, but also in the created order. That's the order that everyone has access to easily, and we can conform ourselves to. Those are the natural goods. There's a natural good to masculinity whose end is protection, provision, family, virtue, truth, all that kind of stuff. So that's what I would get at. I think in terms you talk about evangelicals, people who are trying to be influencers to influence and get a platform by itself, I mean, that's not important. But you should seek to influence people. I mean, how do you do a good work unless you influence people? What is leadership if not getting people to follow you? So whenever someone criticizes being an influencer, I know what they mean. You shouldn't be like an Instagram model or what, I don't know. Like that's the thing. But to my mind, it's like, oh, so you should just not try to be a leader. No, you want to be a leader, but you want to do it in an ethical, moral, virtuous way. So if we ran this podcast and it was all about just like all clickbait and this kind of whatever could get the most possible clout the fastest, yeah, that would be probably suspicious. But if you're trying to do something, we're trying to, I think, edify one another, grow our minds, align our thinking, our emotions, our will, our affections to the nature of things so that we can share through our words our discoveries with others and thereby give them the opportunity to flourish by means of correcting their mismatched thoughts, affections, and will, and matching that to the created order, because that's the way God made things. That's the way that reason, order made all things. Then that's actually a good end. We've already defined it. That's a naturally good end. And I think all of us might have, we may not always publicly say it, but we have also a supernatural end that through aligning yourself with the order of things, and we can talk about this next time, that is what I would call pre-evangelism. So this is why I like cultural Christianity. I'm a big fan of it. Because cultural Christianity, cultural Christians, are those who can see by experience that if they align themselves with the created order of things, that they are having a better life, a more successful life, because they are aligning themselves with the Creator.
Right.
And so evangelism at that point is much simpler. So you can just give the 10 Commandments, and they're like, yeah. Whereas it's much more difficult to evangelize a non-cultural Christian, or can be. That could be another topic for a podcast, why cultural Christianity is good.
Well, yeah, we're talking about goodness because goodness is tied to glory. So that's where it functions on so many levels. Even on a daily, like 1% of social media users actually post stuff. 5% or so will like or comment, and then the rest are just browsing, right? But for those 5% who aren't posting and are just liking, they are honoring what they find glorious in a way. That hitting of like is a way of demonstrating what they reflect, and there's goodness tied up in it. And so your definition of goodness, and whether you have formed a positive definition of goodness that's fundamentally attached to God himself and united to him, that's going to inform how you honor and, have joy because of it. And so I think it's glory is very practical. It's a very, very much tied up with our day-to-day experience. There's a book called Glory Hunger by J.R. Vassar, and I haven't read the whole thing, but he kind of talks about how, like, just day by day, every day, we're seeking after glory. We can't help it. It's in our nature to, it's not just the child who's looking for the, good work from their dad, which they do seek, of course, but it's not just in the teenager who seeks it in their peer pressure groups and those sorts of things, but it's in us as adults, and it's in the inner ring of as C.S. Lewis described it. We're kind of seeking after that glory. Mm-hmm. We just can't help but want that affirmation and to be on the inside of the good of the company or the good of the friend circle or whatever. And we want that and we crave it. And that's not wrong, to have that inner hunger, that glory hunger. And I think we just need to direct it toward goodness as opposed to folly.
Yes.
So that makes me think of something I observed as I was watching the Olympics recently. It seems like a really good object lesson for what we've been discussing, because you're seeing the best athletes in the world in their discipline. And then you're also watching how they react and respond to who wins and loses. And I found it, I can't help but get caught up in the glory of a great performance. And so when you watch the Canadian relay team, when they won gold, it was a moving experience for me to see, even though I don't follow it. I don't know who's running. But it was a glorious thing. And in contrast to that, we saw there, not to pick on the Americans, but there was some American sprinters who had been interviewed earlier, and who and the question was, are you concerned at all about the Canadian team, and he's like, who? And then the interviewer thought he hadn't heard, so he repeated it, like, the Canadian team, and then he said again, who? Like, it was it was a very, very bragging sort of, who are these people, they're nothing to us, and they ended up winning. So there's this sort of like, oh, that's unvirtuous, and also watching others, I saw some celebrating in a really self-aggrandizing way. And again, in my spirit, I was like, oh, that's ugly. That's not virtuous to win in that way and to kind of rub it in people's faces. And so, like you were saying, Andrew, like, glory it's a part of our everyday. It's a part of human affairs. We can either recognize it or not. And we can either, I think,
the cliffhanger. Phil, you might have cut out in and out there.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry about that.
But what was the end of your sentence? You're back now. It's a cliffhanger for me.
Oh, I said that, all I said was, glory is a fact of human endeavor, and so we can either recognize it or not, and then we can either handle it virtuously or not. And I think we saw that on display, at the Olympics.
Yeah, that's great. I think of goodness as gravity. So obviously, the bigger the mass something is, the more we're pulled down to it. Goodness is like that, but all of us have this problem that our minds can't always discern what is good and evil. So, this Olympic athlete is still pursuing, sounds like vainglory or whatever that is in that case. And one of our goals is to break down that beclouded vision in front of us, to see through, peek through it if we can, to align ourselves with the way things are so that we can know good from evil. Now, as a Christian, we would argue that we have a clearer revelation, which is the Bible, that gives us the cliff notes to rehabilitate or redeem our mental inability to naturally be able to discern good from evil in a perfect way.
Yep.
But I think at a natural level, we're still able to align ourselves to nature. This is why, most people know that they shouldn't steal. Most people know they shouldn't murder. Most people know they should help someone cross the street with a disability. All that stuff, or teachers to teach math, because that's glorious. We have this common sense natural ability, but it gets harder when you think at any sort of inferential level. So, maybe it's good to be an athlete and to work hard, but the inference is maybe how you should treat others. You know what I mean? Like as in the illustration you gave. And when you move from first principles, which are immediately knowable, like don't murder, do no harm, to secondary derivations, that's where our reason sometimes fails us. And I think what this podcast is attempting to do is to align our words and our thoughts and our affections with the way things are, which is actually hard to do. Even with a clearer revelation, it's still hard to do because some of the questions that we ask today are not one-to-one equivalents to ancient traditions texts. So, for example, it's hard to think about copyright law in the digital age. I know that stealing is wrong. Was Napster wrong at the time? I know that murder is wrong, but if you're about to die, am I allowed to take medicine that would slightly elongate your life away? So those are where I think we need added clarity, and that's where I think reason comes in and that discernment comes in. So you move from first principles to derived principles. And I think that's kind of what you're getting with this sort of athleticism illustration where, yeah, we can say that the athletes at the Olympics are great athletes. There's a glory to the hard work they've done, the effect of it, and we should honor that. But should we honor everyone's behavior? There was a Canadian athlete that had, I thought, kind of bad behavior as well. There was that Australian breakdancer who apparently, I don't know what she was trying to do, but maybe trying to make a mockery of things. It was funny, but is that really virtuous? I don't know if it is. So I think that's where the difficulty lies in this conversation. But maybe to kind of bring it back to where we started, and maybe that's how we can end in the next short while here, is I think for human beings, at least in 2024, I don't know if it's always been this way, our biggest danger is not living up to the glory of the particular kind of person that you are. If you were born as a man, as you're born as a child, you become a boy, and your purpose is to become a man. And manliness corresponds to goodness. And sloth is someone who spends 60 hours a week making tons of money to play with their toys, like cars and all that kind of stuff, and boats, works hard, but is actually avoiding the glory that they're called to. And therefore, in my opinion, a lot of our workaholism in today's culture and the way that we mock people who only work 40 hours a week, not 60 or whatever sometimes, is actually a lot of those hard workers are slothful. And they're committing mortal sins which are damning. Because, not all, of course, I'm just giving an illustration to make it clear. I'm not saying this is a universal claim. Because fulfilling your glory sometimes means you have to take a lower paying job so that you can fulfill your family obligations. It actually means that you might go to a lower intensity job with less responsibility, maybe less money too, so that you can be with your wife more. That's glorious. And as evangelicals, as human beings in general, actually, not just evangelicals, we need to be able to identify what that glory is so that we don't mismatch it. Well, that guy works 65 hours a week and has a boat and a Tesla. That's slothful sometimes, not all the time. is slothful because they are not achieving the glory to which they are called. They are workaholics and therefore slothful.
Right. C.S. Lewis commented on people working on weekends, and he's like, it is tiring and unhealthy to lose your Saturday afternoons, but to have them free because you don't matter, that is much worse.
Yeah.
There is a working on the weekends, not because you are seeking glory, but because you're seeking true glory, like the goodness tied to glory, that would reflect who you are, your masculinity, et cetera, your responsibilities, but it's cut off. I think my last kind of thought on this is there is a kind of person who at one time in their life, they pursued glory and they had ambition, a holy ambition, and that was pure and good. And then they got to a point where they just didn't live up to their own expectation. And then they kind of just set their standards lower. And they started to say, well, I won't do the glorious thing. Instead, I will, putter around with this, that, because then it's more achievable. And they rationalize it through like attainable goals. But sometimes it's not just attainable goals. It's easy goals. It's not glory. And like you said, Wyatt, of like a huge danger in this. And I think it's just a poor recognition of how the gospel works in the Christian life of, you don't live up to the glory of God. That's right. That's like what you've learned from childhood of Christianity 101. Yeah, you need forgiveness. Yep, you need repentance. This is going to be an ongoing thing, but still pursue glory. Like, you slothful kid, be a man, grow up. Stop just sitting on your hands and doing the easy thing over the weekends. Like, start the Bible study that you evangelize your neighbor. Like, do the sacrificial thing, whatever that looks like in your life. Like, don't settle. Pursue glory. Yeah, you're going to fail. Welcome to life. Welcome to sin. You are forgiven. Keep on living. Keep on pursuing glory.
Well, I think you have to finish us with the last and final wise word.
Well, what you just said there, Andrew, reminded me of another Luther quote when he said, sin boldly, right? And I think that can be easily misunderstood, but in the sense is there's a boldness, every human endeavor will be tainted with sin. So what you're saying, Wyatt, is that slothfulness and passivity is a kind of sinfulness. And when we seek glory for the good of others and the glory of God, there will be sin that taints it. So in our boldness, there'll be sin. I think that's what Luther's getting at is don't hold back from attempting great things because it's going to be tainted by the sinfulness of your own heart. The Christian is well equipped with the glory of the gospel to deal with that. And so I think that's good. I think one other thought that comes to mind, Wyatt, when you speak about, in more general terms, in our culture, the way that men especially seem to be lost in their pursuit of glory. They're seeking glory in shallow, empty things, and they're not aligned with what is good. And to me, it comes back to a bigger topic, which I've been thinking a lot about recently, and that's education. But education more in terms of the formation of human beings in our society, how people are being formed, and what kind of vision for life they're being given. And it just seems like we're not only a long way from having a Christian understanding in our culture. I think that's clear. But not only that, but we don't even have a natural law, common grace understanding of virtue and goodness. And so there's the level of confusion and misalignment with what is good and virtuous is so deep and profound that it's really daunting to think how this can be addressed, because it's like you got to get right down to a foundation that's really deep before you can start to rebuild an understanding of of these concepts that aligns with God's truth. And so, I think that's why education is so important. And I think it comes back to what you said about cultural Christianity, is you have got a whole substructure there to work with, which is fundamentally sound, right? And in our post-Christian culture, in our deeply secular Canadian context, that substructure is rotted. It's not there. There's something else in its place.
I missed like a couple words you broke off at the end, but I think what you said is great. The very end, it kind of got a little crackly. I think this is a good conversation, a good way to start the podcast, because I think we want to essentially, through our words or conversations here, pursue goodness so that we can share that goodness with others, so they can more or less align their lives with the way things are created to be, so that they might flourish in all that they do. Do we need to do anything special to end, or should we just end and say we're done for now? And I think we want to do twice a month, roughly, for a what
we'll see schedules allow.
At least once a month. Let's say minimum once a month, and then twice a month is our bonus.
Subscribe, honor us by liking and sharing.
Yeah, honor us by liking all of our posts.
That's right. All right, bye.
Bye, everyone.